Welcome to the next in our Knowledge Mobilization Flash Talk series, which is a project of the Wisconsin Center for Education Research and the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction with support from the U.S. Department of Education. We are really fortunate today to have Dr. Sharon Belton, who is the director of the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service. She directs the research partners, and this is at UW Systems, and is the lead author of a report on voices of Wisconsin students in COVID. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Belton. So thank you so much for being here.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for making time to hear this presentation. I will be talking about the Voices of Wisconsin Students project and what we learned from students about how they were learning, coping, and building resilience during the COVID-19 pandemic. So this was a very large project that was done through partnership with many organizations. While I get the privilege of presenting the findings, this really was a collaborative effort of many organizations across the state of Wisconsin. The project itself was supported by the Wisconsin Department of Health Services with a grant from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention through their Overdose Data to Action grant program. And in terms of what did we do? This was a qualitative focus group project that we conducted last winter in January and February, where we did 23 virtual focus groups with 160 middle school and high school students from across the state of Wisconsin. And you can see from the two maps that I have on this particular slide that we really did make some considerable efforts to try to reach students from across all areas of the state. And in terms of the characteristics of the students that participated, they were attending small schools, large schools, schools in urban, suburban, rural settings. We had broad gender, socioeconomic, and racial diversity amongst the student participants. And so we really feel like we were able to capture the voices of Wisconsin students from a broad range of perspectives. The main themes that came out of the focus group discussions with students are summarized on this particular slide, and I'll talk through them briefly, and then for the purposes of this flash talk, we'll really focus on one in particular that I thought would be interesting for discussion today. First theme, which is perhaps not a surprise, given other quantitative data that has been shared about mental health during the pandemic, but the students that we talked with were experiencing high and very high and increasing levels of stress, anxiety, and depression. So these were not only students who had existing issues with stress and anxiety that was exacerbated by the by the pandemic, but also students who were experiencing these things for the first time. Many of the students that we talked to expressed significant challenges with virtual learning environments. And while the focus groups were conducted last winter, some of the issues in particular that students mentioned, I think are still relevant to learning that might be going on now. Three things in particular that students found particularly challenging were situations where they had to transition from in-person learning to virtual, back to in-person, and back to virtual. Most of the students that participated in the focus groups had undergone some kind of material change in their learning environment, back and forth during the pandemic, which was very stressful for them because they didn't necessarily know, what to expect the next week, for example, in terms of whether they would be learning at home or virtually. Other situations that were particularly stressful for students were situations where they were at home trying to learn virtually while other students were in person, trying to learn the same material at the same time in a synchronous learning environment. Some of the virtual learners expressed this as a feeling of being left behind or left out of the learning process. And a third group of students that expressed concern about virtual learning were those that had to remain virtual because of an underlying health condition that they had, or maybe somebody in their family had, that was very stressful for them because their peers were at school, and they very much wanted to be at school, but they couldn't because of a specific health reason. And it really made them feel a sense of missing out, or in some cases being left behind. And a lot of the students that we talked to expressed a lack of connectedness to their school, to their teachers, to their friends. An example of this would have been freshman students, for example, who had never set foot in their school building because they had been, learning virtually, and might not have had any familiarity with some of the students in their classes because they had maybe just transitioned from a middle school environment to a larger high school setting. A lot of the challenges that the students were experiencing in terms of their learning created heightened expectations of their teachers. They really missed out on some of the spontaneous interactions that you would have with your teacher in a more typical learning environment, and really were looking for leadership from their teachers in terms of helping them get through the pandemic, being able to reach out to their teachers to get questions answered on how to complete homework. And it really put the spotlight from the perspective of the students on the teachers, not only to do what they always do, but also have an even greater role in helping students get through the pandemic. Obviously, there was a lot of discussion amongst the students about their mental health, and many expressed limited awareness of mental health resources that might be available to them in the context of their schools. And not only was lack of awareness a barrier to getting mental health resources in the context of their school setting, but they also expressed concerns about stigma, skepticism that any efforts that they might take to address mental health concerns would help them. And also several students expressed serious concerns about whether situations that they might want to talk about in the context of their school setting would remain confidential. So those were some of the barriers that they expressed. Particularly high school students perceived increases in substance use amongst their peers. Middle school students were more likely to talk about increases in the use of vaping products amongst their friends during the pandemic. For many of the kids, it was something that they had seen happening on social media, and many of them attributed it to, boredom, lack of supervision, being at home, and just, looking for outlets to deal with some of the stress that they were experiencing. So on the positive side, despite the challenges that the students were experiencing, many of them, and I would say almost every student that we talked to, could point to some new kind of coping skill that they had developed as a result of the COVID experience, or had developed some kind of positive outcome as a result. And the last point is what I really wanted to focus on today during the Flash Talk, is that the students overwhelmingly want opportunities to provide meaningful input into decision-making in the context of their school settings and in their communities. We asked the students specifically, what do you need from schools and school leaders to be successful? And involvement in decision-making, being asked their opinions about things, being asked to be included in decisions being made about policies or procedures or things that were impacting them, was really important, both to the high school students and to the middle school students. And this was such a compelling theme during the focus groups that we issued a separate companion report to our main report, where we summarized in their own words all of the things that they said that they need from school leaders to be successful. And obviously there's a lot of words on this slide, but I thought I would pull out just a couple of the quotes that we heard from the students that kind of underscore this theme. And these were fairly representative of the kinds of comments and the discussions that we had about these topics, is that they want schools and school leaders to take more consideration of their opinions and their situations, because some express this as a feeling that schools don't necessarily listen to how they might be experiencing things from their perspective. And something else that was interesting is that some students pointed to the fact that sometimes when they are asked to provide input on things, they're not sure anything happens with it. They're not sure, they ask us to take a survey, but we don't know whatever happens with the results. If you're going to ask us to take a survey, we'd like to know what you're going to do with it, and we'd like to see some tangible action. And for many of the students, it wasn't that they'd be disappointed if their views didn't result in the change that they personally wanted. They just wanted to know that somebody had taken their opinion seriously. And so they want to have more involvement and more power in the whole process, particularly in the time period of COVID, where so many of them had expressed that they felt like decisions were being made about them without them. So in terms of some topics for discussion today, I thought it would be interesting to hear, how can schools create meaningful opportunities to have input into decision making? And at the same time, how do we measure the impact of student voice in the process? So obviously, a lot of information was compiled from these reports, and I think a lot of good work is going to be done on some areas of the reports, and look forward to just hearing about sort of the overarching theme is, how do we provide opportunities for students to provide input into decision making, and how do we know if it's working? So thank you.